One of the most often cited reasons for Russian military missteps in Ukraine is the idea that Russian armed forces as a whole are not learning from their mistakes. On the other hand, there are clear indications that Russian forces are adapting, and that these adaptations, though uneven, explain their ability to continue advancing even if such advances are modest by all metrics other than the losses. In this video, we will highlight the adaptations Russia has undeniably made throughout the war, focusing on the tactical and operational levels, and using a consistent structure for every phase. The original Russian pre-war preparations were influenced by late 20th and 21st century examples of fast and decisive military operations that toppled governments within days or weeks. Prime examples included Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, as well as Soviet-led Operation Danube in Czechoslovakia in 1968. These operations, although different in scale and context, shared the central premise of Modernized Blitzkrieg, achieving strategic victory through rapid decapitation of the state leadership, rather than by capturing every inch of territory or annihilating the entire army. Initially, mirroring elements of Danube, Russians planned to deploy special operations forces and VDV airborne troops by helicopters to seize key infrastructure, most notably the Hostomel airport near Kyiv and crucial bridges across the Dnipro River. After that, the airlift using Il-76 transport aircraft would deliver additional airborne units with armored vehicles to enable a lightning advance into the capital and decapitate the Ukrainian government. This air corridor was expected to be secured by precision strikes against Ukrainian fighter aircraft, radars, command posts, and surface-to-air missile batteries. Simultaneously, mechanized and motorized units were to launch a multi-axis ground invasion, overwhelming command and control, isolating defending units across the country and creating a rapid collapse of organized resistance, ideally before Ukraine could even mobilize. Russian planners assumed that Ukrainian units would retreat and surrender when confronted with overwhelming multidirectional pressure, that major cities can be taken with minimal fighting, that the population would be neutral or even welcoming, and that the government would fracture under shock, fleeing abroad or capitulating at the negotiating table. Despite the unrealistic assumptions, the choice of Blitzkrieg-style approach was not inherently unreasonable. Blitzkrieg, developed by German commanders such as Heinz Guderian prior to the World War II, hinged fundamentally on speed, concentration of force, and operational surprise. The goal is to break through enemy defenses quickly with armored spearheads, disrupt command and logistics, and prevent the adversary from forming new defensive line. Once the breach is created, mechanized forces pour through to widen the gap, while advanced elements cut supply lines and encircle defending units. Surrounded and disorganized, these units become unable to hold further advances. Blitzkrieg succeeded best when the defenders cannot mobilize rapidly, when the attackers' logistics flow smoothly, and when the advancing side maintains overwhelming situational awareness. Its appeal, still relevant 8 decades after its conception, lies in the potential to minimize destruction when successful, and reduce the attacker's own casualties by avoiding protracted battles. It's no coincidence that modified Blitzkrieg concepts underpinned the early phases of Desert Storm and Iraqi Freedom. Russian general staff clearly envisioned something similar in Ukraine, or in best-case scenario, a repeat of Operation Danube, where rapid airborne and mechanized action suppressed resistance before any full-scale fighting emerged. As brilliant as this plan was, as always, the devil is in the details. A land-based Blitzkrieg requires two things: meticulous central planning to identify optimal axes of advance, and highly capable local commanders who can rapidly exploit breakthroughs. Russia lacked both. The general staff assumed that Ukrainian resistance would be limited at most, and that large parts of the population would greet Russian units as liberators. As a result, Russian planners intended to thrust armored formations directly towards Kyiv, on both banks of Dnipro River, advancing through Chernihiv and Sumy, while the southern push aimed at Odessa through VDV secured bridges, then Kherson, then Mykolaiv. Meanwhile, conversion advances through Zaporizhia and Kharkiv were supposed to encircle the bulk of Ukrainian forces in Donbass. This reconstruction aligns closely with what actually happened, but with a critical twist, attempting to bypass and blitz through major cities, especially Kyiv's satellite towns such as Irpin, Bucha, and Hostomel, as well as Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv, and Mykolaiv. Russian vanguard elite units were drawn into heavy urban combat and often annihilated entirely. Attempts at thunder runs, modeled after US armored thrusts into Baghdad, failed repeatedly due to stiff Ukrainian resistance and, crucially, widespread armed civilian opposition. Russian forces then attempted to encircle cities, but this was a reactive measure forced by battlefield realities rather than a part of the original plan. Local commanders had poor situational awareness, relying on outdated maps and lacking adequate intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets. Rigid Russian command structures, where initiative is discouraged, meant higher-level officers repeatedly ordered frontal assaults or high-speed advances, while low-level officers simply executed their will, even when they knew the odds. As a result, both elite and regular units were sent into thunder runs, from which no one returned. Facing ambushes by Ukrainian troops and partisans, even deep in rural areas, Russian formations failed to encircle any major city except Mariupol. Returning to Hostomel, the initial air assault met fierce resistance and resulted in helicopter losses. Ukrainian artillery and airstrikes followed, as air assault forces counterattacked, encircling the airfield. Because Ukrainian air defenses remained mostly intact, Russia cancelled the planned airlift of approximately 18 Il-76 transport aircraft, a final setback to the near-perfect plan. Although Russian ground troops eventually reached the airfield, they encountered entrenched defenders, constant flank attacks, and collapsing logistics. Ultimately, they were forced to withdraw entirely from the northern Ukraine after further heavy losses. The battle for Kyiv, the strategic centerpiece of the invasion plan, was lost. However, the Blitzkrieg did succeed in the south. As we explained in a separate video, terrain, thin Ukrainian defenses and lack of defenders allowed Russia to capture large swaths of land quickly, including the only regional center ever captured, Kherson, as well as to execute the war's only major operational encirclement in Mariupol. In eastern Ukraine, Russian forces pushed Ukrainians back in several areas but encountered the most capable and prepared Ukrainian formations, slowing the advance. When Russia's offensive around Kyiv collapsed, the General Staff was forced to confront a new reality. The Ukrainian state had not disintegrated, the army had not melted away, the population was overwhelmingly hostile, mechanized thrusts proved fragile, inflexible, and poorly supported. The entire Blitzkrieg approach had been built on false premises, and the war demanded an entirely different approach on both tactical and operational levels. When Russian forces withdrew most of their combat power from Kiev axis and redeployed to Donbass, they shifted their strategic objective towards quickly taking at least the eastern part of Ukraine. The city Severodonetsk, heavily urbanized and well defended by Ukrainian troops, became one of the principal targets. Rather than repeating a fast mechanized thrust, Russian planners chose to rely primarily on firepower over speed. At that time, Russians held substantial quantitative advantage in artillery systems and ammunition. Supply lines in the Donbass region were shorter and far less vulnerable than those used during the initial blitz towards Kyiv. This made sustained artillery fire more feasible logistically, but the plan was not limited to bombardments. The Russians also intended to follow up with mechanized assaults through areas reduced to rubble, exploiting the destruction brought by artillery to the fullest extent. Similar actions were planned on the flanks of the Severodonetsk salient, especially near towns like Popasna and along the bank of the Siversky Donets River. In effect, the Russian General Staff moved away from a modernized NATO-style blitzkrieg towards a form of warfare more reminiscent of classic Soviet-era World War II doctrine, often called the Wall of Fire, Fire Curtain, or Walking Barrage. Its logic is to avoid Russian in well-prepared defenses. Instead, first amass large artillery concentrations to inflict attrition, flatten fortifications, and disrupt enemy command and control. Once the defenses and positions are destroyed or severely degraded, armor and infantry advance immediately behind the barrage, aiming to overrun disorganized defenders before they can reform any coherent resistance. In classical form, this doctrine requires extremely dense artillery, dozens or even hundreds of guns per kilometer, plus centralized fire planning, accurate targeting data, and tight synchronization between artillery, armor, and infantry. In 2022, Russian forces lacked many of these capabilities. Their command and control and coordination were often poor, communications unreliable, and intelligence or reconnaissance limited. Despite that, they retained some hope of local encirclement as a faint remnant of blitzkrieg thinking, but in practice they built a kind of doctrinal Frankenstein out of a Soviet-style fire tactics with mechanized assaults added on top. Even though conditions were far from optimal, in some sectors this doctrine still produced limited gains. Another topic worth exploring is why the Russians, despite having a significant advantage in aviation, ultimately relied heavily on artillery. The reason lies in how quickly the air power advantage eroded. Early strikes failed to destroy a significant portion of Ukrainian air defenses, which continued operating across the country far more efficiently than the Russian General Staff expected. As a result, during the first months of the war, the Russians suffered losses of at least 18 fixed-wing aircraft and 45 helicopters, according to the photographic evidence. After these earlier setbacks, Russian aviation gradually shifted towards risk-averse tactics. Pilots avoided flying deep behind the front line to reduce chances of being shot down, instead staying close to the Russian-controlled territory and flying at low altitudes. Because Russia lacked any meaningful seed capabilities, no systematic suppression of Ukrainian radars, no coordinated targeting of SAM batteries, and very limited anti-radiation missile use, its aircraft could not operate freely. This pushed Russian Air Force into mostly defensive posture, relying on obsolete low-accuracy weapons and avoiding contested airspace. Effectively, by the summer 2022, this removed Russian aviation from the fight as a decisive operational tool, the role aviation usually has in NATO doctrine. It remained present, but unable to shape the battlefield the way Russians imagined. This vacuum naturally made artillery the main instrument of firepower, since tubes and rocket launchers did not have to expose themselves to Ukrainian air defenses and could deliver sustained fire with far less risk. Only in 2023 did Russian aviation partially re-enter the battlefield, with introduction of OMPK, an improvised Russian analog of the American JDAM glide bomb kit, but we will discuss the development a little bit later. The first testing ground for this new tactic was Severodonetsk. For over a month, the city endured relentless bombardments from hundreds of Russian artillery pieces. After each massive barrage, Russian forces advanced with concentrated groups of tanks, IFVs and infantry, aiming for at least a partial encirclement of Ukrainian defenders. While this encirclement would be far more limited than the sweeping envelopments in earlier plans, if it succeeded, it would be a significant blow to Ukraine. But eventually, the wall of fire delivered only mixed results. For instance, near Popasna, Russian units managed to breach Ukrainian lines after destroying key defensive positions and inflicting heavy defenders' losses, allowing advances beyond expectations in that sector. A simultaneous effort near Belogorivka intended as a converging strike across the Seversky Donets River ended in disaster. In light of this failure, Russian commanders suspended large-scale encirclement attempts for a time and reverted to methodical, block-by-block city fighting. Eventually, Ukrainians withdrew across the river after inflicting serious casualties and equipment losses on Russia, showing that even a successful wall of fire operation could be brutally attritional. A critical blow to the Russia's fire-centric doctrine came with the arrival in summer 2022 of the US-supplied M142 HIMARS rocket artillery system. The first HIMARS units reached Ukraine in late June 2022 and became operational almost immediately. Ukrainian forces began systematically targeting Russian ammunition depots, logistics hubs, bridge lines, and supply routes far behind the front line. Within weeks, ammunition dumps across occupied territories erupted in massive fires and explosions. One public assessment noted that after the introduction of HIMARS, Russian artillery's ammunition consumption dropped dramatically, from as much as 12,000 to 15,000 rounds per day down to roughly 6,000 rounds per day. At the same time, Ukrainian forces also enhanced their counter-battery capabilities, pairing more modern and accurate Western artillery pieces with drone-assisted Soviet variants to gradually degrade Russian artillery assets in frequent duels. These failures provide Ukrainian forces with an opportunity to launch counter-offensives in the fall 2022, taking back significant stretches of territory. Yet, in the broader operational sense, the Russians did not demonstrate any substantial adaptation. Their approach remained overwhelmingly artillery dependent. In some areas, this worked, such as in Kherson region, where Russian artillery inflicted serious losses on Ukrainian units during their assaults. In contrast, in the Kharkiv region, the Ukrainian advance was so fast and so deep that Russian artillery pieces were overrun by the advancing forces before they could meaningfully contribute to the battle, a result of nearly perfectly executed Ukrainian Blitzkrieg. By the end of 2022, it was clear that Russian tactics had to change. However, the general staff was essentially out of ideas. The same methods, massing artillery for destruction's sake and launching armored thrusts with columns of tanks and IFVs, continued to dominate their thinking. This time, innovation would not come from within the formal military hierarchy. Instead, it emerged from people who had been part of the system but were either pushed out or had abandoned it, seeing no future in existing structure. These individuals, often veterans of Chechen wars and numerous other Russian conflicts, found their place in PMC Wagner. Under the leadership of the charismatic and ruthless Yevgeny Prigozhin, the mercenaries who already had extensive experience with infantry-centric warfare across Africa had been seen fighting near Kyiv in early days of the war. After being redeployed to the Donbass, they chose to fight as unified formation, openly despising the Russian command, which they viewed as perfectly combining the inability to achieve meaningful results with the constant tendency to get its own subordinates killed. Apparently, Russia's political leadership and Putin himself started to share this dissatisfaction, all due to a sequence of military failures and the need to declare partial mobilization while maintaining the facade that everything is totally under control and goes according to the plan. This is where Prigozhin saw his opportunity. At some apparently very convenient moment, he successfully pitched a new set of tactics that his PMC could implement to finally break Ukrainian defenses in Donbass. The pitch worked, and Putin redirected substantial resources previously controlled by the Ministry of Defense into Wagner's hands, a remarkably bold gamble. These resources included hundreds of artillery pieces with ammunition, tanks, armored fighting vehicles, air defense systems, and even tactical bombers and ground attack aircraft. Most importantly, however, Prigozhin received permission to recruit men from places he knew very well from personal experience, Russian prisons, which would define one of the largest and bloodiest engagements of the war, the Battle for Bakhmut.
Кто нам нужен? Понятно, что вы все молодцы, все нужны, но идеальный кандидат, так скажем, желательно отсидевший пятнашку и более, желательный впереди пятнашка и более, желательно не один раз за убийство, тяжкие телесные, разбой, грабеж. Нам нужны ваши криминальные таланты. Я сам отсидел десятку, прежде чем стать героем России. Имею небольшое количество талантов. Они мне очень помогают в жизни. Уверен, что у вас у многих их больше. И в конце второй недели вы пойдете в свои первые задачи по штурму окопов, укрепов, населенных пунктов или других задач.
Despite having access to artillery and armor, MC Wagner immediately pivoted to using infantry as the main tool for advances. By that point, it has become obvious that Ukrainian artillery, now reinforced by some high-quality Western systems, could leverage recon drones to blunt most of the Russian mechanized assaults. The widespread presence of modern anti-tank guided missiles, advanced grenade launchers, and landmines further reduced to near zero the chances of any major armored breakthrough, whether in open fields or inside cities. Consequently, starting around July 2022, Wagner began recruiting thousands of convicts for short-term 6-month contracts, promising pardons as their main incentive. This unusually short contract length for frontline service was the first signal that Wagner's approach would differ drastically from that of the formal military. For example, at this time, the Russian Ministry of Defense still tolerated 500s, personnel refusing to fight, but under Wagner there was no such option. During personal recruitment tours, Wagner's leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, made it clear that refusal means death.
Есть 3 греха, за которые расстреливаем на месте. Грех номер 1 – это дезертирство. Никто не дает заднюю.
Recruiting violent criminals from prisons, Wagner seemed to acknowledge there would be problems enforcing traditional discipline, so instead, they resorted to ruthless coercion. Torture and executions were routinely used to punish refusers and those who tried to retreat. A core of experienced Wagner veterans retained planning, command, and specialized functions, while the newly recruited inmates, effectively expendable manpower, were sent to front in mass. Wagner's primary target under the new model became Bakhmut, a mid-sized but heavily fortified and urbanized city in the Donbass region. The plan was to employ infantry-centered tactics, grinding down Ukrainian defenses through sheer numbers of small infantry groups, rather than relying on mechanized trusts or massed artillery barrages. Wagner deployed small assault units, typically 10 to 20 men, drawn from prisoners, repeatedly towards Ukrainian positions. These units were often sent in sequential waves, sometimes along different routes, less than a kilometer apart, with the purpose of overwhelming defenders through attrition. As Russian drone use increased, many of these groups attempted to flank Ukrainian positions or strike at perceived weak points. But when defenses proved too robust, Wagner did not redirect these units. Instead, it simply sent more to overwhelm defenders. Once Ukrainians rebuilt their positions, for instance by returning fire and depleting their ammunition, Wagner employed artillery and armor in a supporting role to press the advantage. Only after sufficient weakening of the defense would more experienced Wagner mercenaries move in to exploit breaches and secure captured positions. If those mercenaries failed, the cycle would repeat again, and more convict groups would be sent in. Although we usually avoid the emotionally charged term meat waves, this depiction is quite accurate, but these were not classic line charges but dozens of small assault groups advancing along independent routes, often invisibly from the single drone feed. That was actually the whole point of the new tactics, and the reason why there is a limited footage of such infantry waves. What is visible, however, are isolated assault groups and fields around Bakhmut littered with thousands of bodies, fully demonstrating the price of a new Russian approach. Within Wagner's formation, there was also internal specialization. Some recruits were assigned to build fortifications after positions were taken. Others, sometimes unarmed, served as mules, carrying radios, ammunition, water, food, or batteries until killed. Such auxiliary troops underscore how Wagner treated many of its members, not as soldiers, but as disposable assets, tiny replaceable gears in the grinding war machine. Overall, assumptions of Wagner's command proved accurate. Ukrainian defenders fought fiercely, but small infantry groups were harder to target effectively with artillery than the large formations or tanks. In many areas on the flanks of Bakhmut, Wagner managed to seize ground gradually, using repeated small unit assaults that eventually bypassed or encircled pockets of Ukrainian defenders. While drone-drop grenades and mortar fire remained effective, the very large number of waves Wagner was willing to commit often overwhelmed expectations. Despite suffering heavy losses, the convict assault groups pressed on, driven by fear of execution and torture. The result was that Battle for Bakhmut evolved into kind of World War I style slugfest. Trench warfare, attritional infantry assaults, and grindy, incremental gains, rather than maneuver or sweeping encirclement. Throughout late 2022 and into early 2023, Wagner's brutal small unit tactics allowed them to inch forward despite enormous human cost. At the same time, the regular Russian military continued to experiment, occasionally reverting to mechanized operations or small-scale fire-and-move assaults, and deploying limited artillery use. Most of these efforts ended in disasters. A striking example occurred in early 2023 near Vuhledar, where Russian armored columns suffered catastrophic losses against well-prepared Ukrainian defenses, highlighting once again the risks of mechanized trusts specially planned by Russian officers. Meanwhile, by May 2023, near Bakhmut, where only Wagner's methods were used, they had pushed deeply into Ukrainian flank positions. Yet, the advance remained far too slow to achieve a full encirclement. Ukrainian defenders were forced to fight along the last road into the city, then endured prolonged trench warfare followed by brutal urban combat, often compared to the ferocity of historic battles like Stalingrad. Even after months of fighting, the pace remained grinding and the toll of human life was staggering. Finally, after roughly 8 months of continuous assaults, Wagner's offensive around Bakhmut exhausted itself. Their conflict with the Russian Ministry of Defense cut off their access to many resources. Most critically, in early February 2023, Wagner was barred from further recruiting from prisons, the backbone of their wave assault system. After they succeeded in pushing Ukrainians out of the last district of Bakhmut, Wagner mercenaries immediately vanished from the front. Within months, the conflict with Russian Ministry of Defense culminated into so-called March of Justice, the mutiny in June 2023, and, after the plane crash that killed Prigozhin, the effective disintegration of Wagner as an independent fighting force, effectively already destroyed by Ukrainians in Bakhmut a few months ago, which triggered above-mentioned events. Even though the notorious PMC collapsed, its brutal tactics had a lasting legacy. The Russian Ministry of Defense eventually adopted the penal recruitment model, launching its own Convicts for Service program. The MOD created a units like Storm Z, later reorganized into Storm V under new legislation, essentially formalizing Wagner's brutal approach within the regular army, expanding it towards mobilized since 2022 men, not just inmates. Under this model, new recruits were organized into small assault detachments, assigned minimal training, light mechanized support, and sent to the front in large numbers. As a result, the whole Russian war effort began to resemble a deferred-scale version of Wagner's infantry waves. High turnover and reliance on cheap human resources rather than Soviet combined arms sophistication. Mechanized assaults still occurred, but when vehicles or armor were lost, as often happened, Russian forces reverted to infantry-heavy Wagner-style assaults. In places like Avdiivka, after repeated failures with armor and heavy losses, attackers still relied on small unit infantry assaults. Meanwhile, the wear and tear of Russian artillery, logistical strain and ammunition shortages further weakened their ability to support large-scale maneuver offensives. Yet, we have to mention that elements of wall of fire and fortifications were successful during repelling the Ukrainian 2023 summer counteroffensive. However, Arguably, the missteps of Ukraine and its partners played a bigger role in why this operation was not successful. By 2024, the Russian army had finished a cycle of transformation into force with a tiny core of professionals, pilots, artillerymen, drone operators, and some officers, and an expanding, replaceable backbone of convicts, mobilized men, and contract soldiers, all thrown into head-on assaults under enemy drones in small infantry groups. Often delivered to the battlefield in mass, on motorcycles, ATVs, or civilian cars, more than half of these were annihilated by drones and artillery before reaching the drop-off spots. Yet, sheer numbers still produced limited gains. Yet, the Russian command did not change its primary strategic goal to push Ukrainians at least out of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. In the beginning of 2024, the Battle of Avdiivka, which at this point had lasted over 2 years, with an active city assault phase over 3 months, did not show much of a change in Russian tactics. After the city was essentially leveled by OMPK glide bombs, Ukrainian forces retreated avoiding encirclement and took positions in less reinforced, yet still urbanized, smaller settlements by the end of February 2024. The OMPK glide bombs, which allowed Russian aviation to attack from areas out of range of Ukrainian air defenses, became at one point one of the main challenges for Ukrainians. Using large Soviet stockpiles, but with upgrade kits which itself are called OMPK or Unified Gliding and Correction Modules. These had overall high efficiency, significantly degrading adversary positions, especially in urban environments. However, at some point, the Ukrainians found electronic warfare measures to jam them, and from there, the game of cat and mouse started, which made OMPK bombs ineffective for some periods of time. The end of this year also gave birth to another rare Russian technological innovation, fiber optic FPVs. In short, these are the regular attack drones that cannot be jammed and can fly longer distances, which made them a significant upgrade over radio-controlled FPVs. What is also worth mentioning is the Russian signature maneuver of building up two pincers around the heavily fortified city to weaken logistics and force Ukrainians to retreat. Many observers, with rather questionable credibility, often give excessive credit to such approach, but it's hard to tell how much real operational thinking goes into it. What usually happens is that Russians right away try to advance inside cities, and, after burning through their significant number of troops in fruitless assaults, they start naturally gaining ground on the city flanks, where a less urbanized environment gives them an advantage. Wave after wave of small infantry groups eventually envelops the city, leaving literal trails of dead bodies and burned down armor hulls on captured land. After that, they indeed threaten Ukrainian logistics and forced retreats, but because of the grueling advance takes months, the results are always modest and fail to encircle Ukrainian troops. The historical textbook example of such pincer movement is actually the Soviet Operation Uranus in 1942. Soviet mechanized troops advanced 60 to 80 kilometers in about 3 to 4 days, enabling a large-scale operational level encirclement of the German 6th Army at Stalingrad. For the modern Russian army, it took the entire 2024, a full year, to push roughly 40 kilometers forward from Avdiivka towards their next target, Pokrovsk, through mostly open terrain. This means Russian forces were on average moving at least 130 times slower than the Soviets, even though the width of their front line was significantly shorter. So, while the modern Russian infantry-based pincers are somewhat effective in pushing Ukrainians back, it's purely tactical tool, not an operational breakthrough method, as painted by many, especially given the heavy drone-inflicted losses in the process. The reliance of Ukrainians on FPV drones shaped Russian tactics, as did the fact that in 2024 Ukrainians started suffering from severe desertion. Drones made battlefield conditions far more dangerous and far less dependent on individual skill. Footage showed one clear point: drones on both sides do not care how well equipped or trained a soldier is. Once it is time to rotate out of position, the chances of being hit, especially on the open Donbas terrain or in a vehicle, are extremely high. The battlefield became perfectly observable in good weather, making hiding nearly impossible. While drones still allowed Ukrainian forces to repel large Russian mechanized assaults, especially during the defensive phase of the Kursk operation in late 2024, they also degraded Ukrainian morale. With the battlefield now even more favoring quantity over quality, due to overwhelming number of drones, the strategic balance shifted a little bit closer towards Russia. Combined with war fatigue, this led many Ukrainian soldiers to leave positions without orders. Part of the blame also undeniably lies with the Ukrainian command, which, despite promoting innovation and often squeezing water out of the rock in terms of tactics, still in many places suffered from bureaucracy, incompetence and negligence. But the most important factor was that Ukraine lacked an institutional system of harsh punishments for unauthorized withdrawal, unlike Russia, which by early 2025 had filled the internet with videos of torture and abuse conducted by Russian commanders against their own troops. Without any approval to such measures, it's still a fact that Ukraine had neither such punitive machine nor enough money to pay sky-high bonuses to new recruits, the pool of which shrank significantly after observing new brutal battlefield realities. Thus, desertion and weak recruitment numbers, which wore down Ukrainian forces more than battlefield losses, combined with the explosion of drone usage, gave a burst to a new Russian tactical adaptation. After Avdiivka, Russian forces conducted multiple offensives with only tactical but still meaningful results. In the beginning of 2025, they stood at the gates of Pokrovsk, with most progress achieved to the south of this Donbass stronghold. The cost of this were not only hundreds of thousands of losses, but also almost all their armored vehicles left. Now, feeling a real shortage and fully understanding the danger of drones, the Russians up-armored these so-called turtle tanks before being sent into rare at this point mechanized assaults. To the north, they were stuck in urban combat in Toretsk and Chasiv Yar, feeling the Ukrainian forward positions were now defended by fewer and fewer troops, but heavily supported by drones that formed what soldiers on the ground increasingly called the Killzone. The Russians realized that their small infantry groups have to become even smaller. By early 2025, the traditional front line gradually started to disappear in the hottest parts of the Donbass. Instead, the battlefield turned into Killzone, a constantly shifting strip between roughly 500 meters to 10 kilometers deep, where Russian and Ukrainian hideouts are chaotically intermixed. This is the area where both sides' drones constantly surveil and hunt, and where any movement, even standing up, is potentially lethal. Behind this, a larger 20 to 30 kilometers gray zone is equally visible to drones from both sides and covered by artillery and FPVs. But the closest few kilometers to the enemy formed the real kill zone, a deadly space where soldiers lived in improvised underground holes, rarely moved during the day, and survived only by camouflage, luck, and supply drops from friendly drones. Having no other choice, Russian assault pairs now moved in groups of two, camouflaged by anti-thermal blankets, crawling long distances at night, freezing during the day, and being supplied by drones. Because the kill zone was saturated with Ukrainian FPVs, Russians attempted to overload Ukrainian drone crews through sheer quantity of microgroups, something that Ukrainians were unable and unwilling to do. The goal was not to break through in large numbers, but to leak through, to seep into Ukrainian defensive network of observation posts and isolated dugouts. Once a few Russian soldiers made it through, they accumulated in small points of condensation, then moved again in pairs to isolate observation posts or ambush Ukrainian drone operators and mortar crews, the highest priority targets. Because soldiers on the open terrain, similar to armored vehicles, could not survive in or near the kill zone, FPVs hid them even 20-30 kilometers behind the front and ambushed their vehicles on rows. Urban environments ironically became easier for Russians to infiltrate than before. In a city, once dozens of Russian two-man teams sipped into different blocks, hunting them became extremely difficult. Ukrainian forces often succeeded in eliminating many of these groups, but the attackers accepted high losses, relying on constant replenishment to create gradual local collapses, while the Ukrainian shortage of men was constantly looming. Exactly in such a way, Russians infiltrated and took a foothold in such towns as Pokrovsk, Kupiansk or Siversk. This approach is sometimes compared to the Moti tactics, developed by Finnish forces during the Winter War, which relied on breaking larger enemy formations into small isolated pockets, called motis, that could be efficiently destroyed by the Finns, who lacked the firepower and manpower to confront Soviets head-on. Both approaches rely on small, mobile and decentralized units operating independently, aiming to cut off, isolate and dismantle enemy positions, rather than break through them directly. Yet, Russian Killzone Infiltration lacks almost all the advantages of the Moti tactic. First, Russian losses did not decrease with the adoption of this new assault approach. They actually increased due to deliberate use of large number of groups intended to overwhelm enemy drone capabilities. Unlike the Finns, they make little use of terrain knowledge or other contextual advantages, instead relying primarily on superior numbers to infiltrate. Additionally, unlike Finnish assaults, often conducted on skis to achieve rapid mobility, Russian advances, even when using motorcycles, rarely achieve the speed necessary to encircle large adversary pockets. In practice, the tactic mostly involves isolating scattered observation posts one by one, which renders the overall speed of advance and losses inflicted on the enemy negligible. on a larger scale. So, does the Killzone Infiltration tactic work at the tactical level? To some extent yes, but largely because of Ukrainian attrition and troop shortages, not because the approach is particularly innovative or efficient. Here, it's important to clarify what efficient actually means. Efficiency can be measured as the outcome achieved relative to the resources expended, whether the territory gained or losses inflicted on the enemy over the time and manpower invested. By any of these metrics, none of the Russian tactics demonstrated meaningful results that could, even over time, accumulate into strategic objectives, such as complete defeat of their adversary. In conclusion, it's clear that the Russians have introduced a number of adaptations that have reshaped certain aspects of the conflict, both technological, such as OMPK glide bombs and fiber optic FPVs, and tactical, like the phased assaults we have examined. Yet, strikingly, none of these innovations address a fundamental flaw in the Russian military practice. They do not reduce Russian losses, which remains a key factor limiting their success to tactical achievements. Even against the Ukrainian army weakened by attrition and desertion, Russian advances only accelerate under adverse weather conditions that limit the effectiveness of Ukrainian drones, and even then, the pace is too slow to achieve operational encirclements capable of destroying enemy forces. We also want to highlight that exactly this, inflicting maximum casualties on the enemy, undeniably has to be the main desired outcome of any tactical, operational, or even strategic engagement. All other outcomes are secondary because they allow the enemy to stay in the fight. Exactly this was highlighted at some point by Kutuzov, Clausewitz, Moltke, Schlieffen, Rommel, Patton, and many other commanders who focused all their attention on how to defeat the enemy army rather than push them out of certain positions. Without such decisive outcomes, Russian forces are repeatedly trading men for territory, often empty or devastated land, treating soldiers as effectively infinite, when in reality they are not. This mindset is best seen in equipment. The Russian past reliance on tanks and IFVs eventually turned into reliance on civilian vehicles, donkeys, and horses, underscoring a persistent underestimation of how finite resources actually are. At the same time, while Russia possessed these resources, its approaches, while inefficient, will bear actual results, which again, by all means should not be underestimated by Russian adversaries. Ultimately, so-called evolution of Russian tactics, which we used for the title, is somewhat of a widespread misinterpretation. While their methods achieve isolated tactical effects, they resemble a regression from the objectively better principles of modernized Blitzkrieg, the first, World War II and then World War I thinking. In essence, Russian adaptations, especially technical ones, have altered the mechanics of the engagements in their favor, but without solving the deeper structural inefficiencies of their military, reliant on the concept of the soldier as a totally expandable and always easily replaceable unit.